Chapter 1. The Shadow Awakens. The night was unnaturally still. Not even the wind dared to rustle the trees outside as Ethan sat alone in his dimly lit bedroom, staring at the darkened corners of his room. The power had flickered twice already, and each time the shadows seemed to shift, as if something was trying to break free from them. He tried to dismiss the feeling of unease, chalking it up to exhaustion. But then it happened. A shadow, darker than the rest, crawled from beneath his closet door. At first it was subtle, like a trick of the light, but as he watched, the inky blackness moved, stretching toward him with unnatural purpose. A chill gripped Ethan's spine. He reached for his bedside lamp, but before his fingers could touch the switch, the bulb exploded, plunging the room into complete darkness. And then, a whisper, right behind him. A rush of air brushed against his neck, ice cold, carrying the scent of something damp and stale. The darkness around him seemed to thicken, pressing in on him like unseen hands. His breath hitched as a second whisper followed the first, so close to his ear that he could feel it. Even his stomach clenched. His mind screamed at him to run, to move, to do something, but his body remained frozen in place, trapped in the weight of terror. Then, slowly, a sound emerged from the blackness behind him, a low, deliberate scraping, like fingernails dragging against wood. He forced himself to turn his head. The closet door, which had been slightly ajar, was now wide open. The darkness inside was deeper than the rest of the room, an abyss that swallowed all light. Something shifted within it, a flicker of motion, too quick to track, but there nonetheless. His pulse thundered in his ears. Then a hand, inky black and twisted, reached out from the void. Fingers unnaturally long, the tips curved into sharp, jagged points. They dragged across the wooden floor as the thing pulled itself forward. Ethan staggered back, his chest tightening with sheer panic. His legs finally responded, and he scrambled off his bed, heart racing as his hands fumbled for his phone, his only source of light. The screen illuminated the room in a weak, bluish glow, casting long shadows against the walls. But when Ethan dared to look back toward the closet, the hand was gone. Only the open door remained, its darkness yawning hungrily at him. But the silence was worse. The whispering had stopped, and something was waiting for him to make a move. Chapter 2. The Footsteps in the Dark. Ethan's breathing came in shallow gasps as he stared at the open closet door. The darkness inside was absolute, a swirling void that threatened to consume the very air around it. He knew something had been there. Something had reached for him. But now, it was gone. Or worse, it had moved. The silence in the room stretched, pressing against his ears, suffocating in its weight. Then, just as he took a shaky step backward, tap, tap, tap. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, impossibly soft. Not from the closet, from the hallway outside his room. Ethan's stomach dropped. His bedroom door was still shut. He had locked it before going to bed, but now something was moving on the other side. He turned his head toward the door, his pulse hammering. The footsteps stopped just outside. A long, heavy silence. Then, a knock. Not a polite knock, not someone seeking entry, but a slow, deliberate tap of knuckles against the wood. 3 times, rhythmic, expectant. Ethan's fingers dug into his bedsheets. He couldn't breathe. Then, the door handle turned. The knob twisted, rattling softly as if someone or something was testing it, pressing against it with just enough force to check if it would open. The shadows under the door shifted. A longer shadow than should have been possible stretched across the floor, creeping toward him. Ethan's phone slipped from his hands. The dull thud of it hitting the floor seemed to break whatever spell had frozen him. His instincts kicked in. He lunged for the lamp again, forgetting the shattered bulb, as if light alone could save him. The rattling stopped, and then the door creaked open. Chapter 3: The Whispering Stains. Ethan's pulse had barely slowed when he noticed the dark stains creeping along the walls. At first, he thought it was just a trick of his still adjusting eyes, a shadow cast by his flickering phone screen. But then, the stains moved. They slithered like ink spreading through water, shifting, stretching, growing. The stains formed patterns, symbols he didn't recognize, twisting and curling as if alive. The darkness seemed to pulse as though breathing along with him. Then came the whispering. Soft at first, just a murmur hidden beneath the silence. Ethan held his breath. The voices were inside the stains, threading through the black, speaking in words too ancient for him to understand. They rose and fell in a rhythm, like a chant, like a summons. His breath hitched when a single word became clear. Stay. The whisper wasn't in his ears. It was inside his bones. Ethan stumbled backward, his foot catching on the edge of the rug. The moment his body hit the floor, the whispering stopped. The stains, once fluid, were motionless. But now, they formed something else. A face. And it was watching him. Chapter 4: The Thing Beneath the Bed. Ethan sat frozen on the edge of his bed, his ears straining against the oppressive silence. He had convinced himself that the whispering stains had been a hallucination, a trick of his exhausted mind. But then came the sound, a slow, deliberate scraping. It came from beneath him. His pulse spiked, his feet hovered just above the floor, and he dared not move, dared not even breathe. The sound came again, a dragging noise, something with nails against the wooden boards beneath his mattress. His childhood fears surged forward with terrifying clarity. The stories of monsters under the bed, dismissed long ago, suddenly felt far too real. He reached for his phone, his fingers trembling. He angled the dim glow downward, toward the narrow gap between the bed and the floor. The space was shrouded in thick, unmoving blackness, too deep for the small height of the bed frame. The scraping stopped. A pause. A heartbeat of silence. Then, a hand shot out. Not human. Not right. The fingers were elongated, twisted with too many joints. The skin was wrong. The color of drowned flesh, mottled and damp. The hand clawed at the air, barely missing his ankle. Ethan jerked back, a strangled gasp escaping his throat. He scrambled backward, pressing against the headboard as the hand retreated into the darkness beneath him. And then the bed lurched. Something moved underneath. The mattress shifted as if something large was pressing up from beneath, as if something was trying to climb out. Ethan leapt from the bed, his feet hitting the cold floor. He stumbled, turned, and grabbed the edge of his mattress. With a rush of adrenaline, he flipped it over. Nothing, just the wooden frame, the floor, and the suffocating silence. But the moment he exhaled, relief threatening to sink in, a whisper drifted up from the floorboards. "I was never under the bed." The voice came from behind him. Chapter 5. Crawling on the ceiling. Ethan's body was rigid with fear. His mind screamed at him to run, to get out of the house, but his limbs refused to move. The whisper that had come from behind him still echoed in his skull, a chilling reminder that whatever haunted this place was no longer lurking beneath his bed. It was somewhere else. A single drop of something cold landed on his arm. He flinched and looked down. A dark smear, thick and oily, clung to his skin. His stomach twisted. Another drop splattered on his shoulder, then another, heavier this time, hitting the floor beside him with a soft, wet plop. Drip, drip, drip. The sound sent his heart racing. He didn't want to look up. He knew something was there, but the urge was unbearable, like an invisible force demanding his attention. Slowly, trembling, Ethan lifted his gaze and froze. A figure was sprawled across the ceiling. At first, it looked almost human, but the longer he stared, the more wrong it became. Its limbs were too thin, too stretched, its fingers too long, splayed like a grotesque spider gripping the beams above. Its body contorted unnaturally, twisting in ways that should have been impossible. And its face. Its face was completely blank. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just smooth, featureless skin stretched tightly over a human-like skull. But then it tilted its head toward him. A new sound filled the room. A wet, cracking noise like bone and cartilage bending the wrong way. And then it started crawling toward him. Chapter 6. The door that opens by itself. Ethan stood frozen, his eyes locked on the old wooden door at the end of the hallway. It had been shut just moments ago. He was certain of it, yet now it stood slightly ajar, revealing nothing but pitch-black emptiness beyond its frame. A slow, cold dread seeped into his bones. He hadn't heard the latch click, hadn't seen the knob turn. It had simply opened. The air grew heavier, thick with an invisible weight pressing against his chest. The shadows along the hallway walls stretched, elongated, as if they were being pulled toward the doorway. A faint creak echoed through the silence. A sound not from the floorboards beneath him, but from within, the room beyond the door. Something was inside. Ethan's breath came in short, uneven bursts. His rational mind screamed at him to back away, to leave the house and never look back. But his feet wouldn't move. It was as if the very air around him had thickened, holding him in place. Then, ever so slowly, the door creaked wider. A rush of cold air spilled out, carrying with it a scent that made his stomach twist. Damp earth, mildew, and something faintly metallic. It smelled like an open grave. And then the whispering started. Low, barely audible at first. like wind passing through hollow bones. But it grew, rising into a chorus of voices, layered upon one another, speaking in a language he didn't recognize. A language that sounded far too ancient to exist in this world. Then, amidst the murmurs, one voice cut through the rest. "Come in." The door slammed open, revealing the black abyss beyond. And something moved inside. Chapter 7: The Flickering Candles. Ethan stepped cautiously into the dimly lit room, his breath shallow. The only source of light came from a row of tall waxen candles, their flames flickering violently as if disturbed by an unseen force. The air was heavy, dense with the scent of melting wax, and something else. Something rancid, almost metallic, like old blood. As he took another step, the flames dimmed, shrinking almost to nothing before roaring back to life. The shadows on the walls elongated, stretching unnaturally toward him. They were moving, not with the flicker of the candlelight, but of their own accord. A soft whisper curled through the room, carried on a breath of cold air that didn't belong. The flames tilted toward him as if drawn by his presence. His skin prickled with the sensation of something just out of sight, something watching. Then, a candle on the far end of the row snuffed out. The darkness swallowed the space where it once stood. Another went out, and another. One by one, the flames died, the shadows thickening, crawling toward him. He turned to leave, but the door had vanished. Only a wall of blackness remained. The last candle flickered, struggling against the unseen force. Its flame twisted unnaturally, stretching upward, forming a shape, a figure. The shape flickered violently, its body shifting in and out of focus. A long, twisted form that had no face but far too many fingers. Ethan's breath caught as the candle's flame spoke, its voice a rasping, distant whisper. "You are not supposed to be here." The whispering around him grew louder, building into a chorus. Voices layered upon voices, some pleading, some laughing, some sobbing in the shadows. The walls shuddered, the flickering candlelight casting moving figures across the space, their silhouettes stretching unnaturally as if trapped in the walls themselves. A freezing gust of air swirled around him, strong enough to make the remaining flames bend sideways before the room went completely dark. And then, in the absolute silence, something exhaled right beside his ear. Chapter 8: Shadows That Move Without Light. Ethan's breath came in shallow gasps as the darkness swallowed the last flicker of candlelight. His heart pounded in his chest, the silence pressing against his ears like a thick, suffocating fog. The room was utterly black, but he felt something moving. Not the way a person moves, not the way light flickers and shifts, but something else, something that obeyed no rules of shadow or physics. The air grew heavy, thick with an unnatural cold that had nothing to do with an open window or a draft. It carried the weight of something watching. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs were locked in place. The ground beneath him felt uneven, as if the wooden floor was subtly shifting beneath his feet. Then, a shadow moved. Not along the walls, not cast by a flickering light, but independent, shifting in the darkness like liquid ink spilled onto an invisible surface. It coiled and stretched, gliding soundlessly toward him. A whisper no louder than a breath curled around his ear. "It sees you." Ethan whipped around, his pulse spiking, but there was nothing. Just that impenetrable blackness, expanding, thickening, crawling toward him from all sides. His fingers fumbled for his phone, desperate for a light source, but as he lifted the screen, a face stared back at him. Not his own. It was gaunt, hollow-eyed, its mouth stretched into a silent, unnatural grin. But the worst part? It wasn't in the reflection of his phone screen. It was right behind him. Chapter 9. The cold hand on my shoulder. Ethan's breath came in sharp, uneven bursts. The face on his phone screen had vanished, swallowed by the suffocating dark, but the sensation of being watched lingered, an unshakable presence that pressed against him from all sides. Then, the air behind him shifted. A slow, creeping cold slithered up his spine, wrapping around his neck like an icy noose. He could hear nothing, no footsteps, no whispering, just the sound of his own ragged breathing. Yet, he knew he was not alone. His muscles locked in place as he felt it. A hand, cold, skeletal fingers closed around his shoulder. The touch was impossibly real, a weight pressing against his skin, seeping through his clothing like winter frost. His body seized, every nerve screaming for him to move, run, escape. But he couldn't. The grip tightened. Then a voice, low, rasping, too close to his ear. "You've been here before." Ethan wrenched forward, tearing himself from the icy grip. He spun around, fists clenched, his pulse roaring in his ears. Nothing. The darkness remained undisturbed. The space behind him was empty. But his shoulders still burned with the ghostly imprint of fingers. And then from the far corner of the room, something breathed. Chapter 10. The Mirror That Lies. Ethan's pulse still thundered in his ears as he stumbled into the next room. His eyes darted frantically, searching for a way out, some path that didn't lead deeper into the suffocating dark. Then his gaze landed on it. A mirror, large, antique, its ornate golden frame gleaming faintly in the dim light. Unlike the rest of the house, the glass was spotless, eerily pristine, but something about it made his skin crawl. He stepped closer, his breath shallow. His reflection should have been there, staring back at him. It wasn't. The mirror showed the room behind him, but he wasn't in it. A cold sweat broke across his brow. His mind scrambled for an explanation, but none made sense. He raised a trembling hand, hesitated, then touched the glass. It was warm. Then, his reflection blinked into existence. Not smoothly, not naturally, it snapped into place like a film skipping forward. His chest constricted as he watched his reflection slowly raise a hand, mirroring his movements, until it didn't. It kept going. The mirrored version of himself tilted its head too far, the vertebrae in its neck visibly shifting beneath the skin, its mouth stretched into a smile, wide and unnatural. Then, slowly, deliberately, it lifted a finger to its lips. Ethan's breath hitched. He stumbled back, but his reflection stayed in place, its eyes locked on him, unblinking, unmoving. Then, it stepped forward. Not in the real world. Inside the mirror. Chapter 11. What lurks behind the walls? Ethan pressed his ear against the cold, crumbling plaster, his breath shallow. The walls whispered. Not the creaks of an aging house, not the scampering of rodents. It was voices, layers of voices, murmuring, shifting, speaking in hushed, indistinct tones. Something was inside. He ran his fingers over the peeling wallpaper, feeling the uneven surface beneath. Then a soft tap from within the wall. His heart slammed against his ribs. Another tap, louder, closer, then a scratch, a deliberate, slow, dragging sound. Ethan recoiled as the wallpaper bulged outward, the plaster underneath cracking, the shape of a hand pressing through from inside. Fingers, too long, too thin, curled as if grasping for something, for him. A whisper, clear now, slithered from the darkness behind the walls. "Let me out." The entire wall shuddered. More hands pressed outward, indenting the plaster, distorting the surface like something was trying to break free. The murmuring turned into frenzied whispers, then a chorus of voices, pleading. A sickening crack echoed as the plaster split open. Then, the room lurched, the walls bending inward, their surfaces rippling like disturbed water. The hands multiplied, dozens, then hundreds, pushing through, their bony fingers clawing at the air, at him. Ethan stumbled backward, his breath a sharp hitch in his throat. The whispers were no longer whispers. They were screams, layered voices shrieking over one another in a cacophony of despair and rage. The wall before him peeled away, revealing a gaping wound in the house itself, a tunnel of writhing, shifting shadows. And inside it, figures moved. Tall, emaciated forms, their bodies merging with the walls, their faces contorted in silent agony, their hollow eyes fixed on him, their mouths moving without sound, as though trapped between dimensions. Ethan's skin prickled with a horrifying realization. The house was not just haunted, it was alive. A violent gust of air roared from the opening, carrying the scent of decay, of centuries-old rot. Ethan gagged, stumbling as the force of it pulled him forward, dragging him toward the writhing abyss. The walls writhed, the arms clawing at his clothes, trying to drag him inside. "No, no," he choked, kicking against the floor, gripping the jagged edges of the doorway. His fingers bled against the splintering wood, his strength slipping as the pull grew stronger. Then, a hand gripped his ankle. Colder than ice, its grip inhumanly strong. Ethan gasped, looking down. A face stared up at him from the void. His own face, pale, lifeless, its lips parted in a twisted grin. Then, with one final tug, Ethan fell. Chapter 12. A Voice That Mimics Mine. Ethan's breath hitched as he stood in the empty hallway, ears straining. The house had fallen silent, but he knew better than to trust the stillness. Just moments ago, he had heard it, his own voice, calling him from the darkness. He swallowed hard. It hadn't been an echo. It hadn't been his imagination. It had been something else. A cold draft slithered through the corridor, brushing against the back of his neck. Ethan turned sharply, his flashlight flickering as he scanned the shadows. Nothing moved. But the feeling persisted, the creeping sensation that something was just beyond his vision, watching. Wait. Then it spoke again. Ethan. His body stiffened. The voice was identical to his own, down to the very breath between syllables. But it hadn't come from in front of him. It had come from right behind him. Slowly, with a pounding heart, he turned. His flashlight trembled in his grip as it illuminated the darkness. The hallway was empty. Then, footsteps. Soft, deliberate, perfectly matching his own. Ethan took a step back. The unseen presence did the same. He turned to flee and came face to face with himself. Not a reflection, not a trick of the light. It was him, grinning, waiting. Chapter 13. The Shifting Silhouette. Ethan stumbled backward, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The figure before him, his own twisted duplicate, tilted its head, the grin widening impossibly, stretching far beyond the limits of human anatomy. Its shadow flickered unnaturally, separating from the body, writhing across the walls like an ink spill bleeding into the air. He turned to run, but his own shadow didn't follow. Instead, it moved on its own. Ethan skidded to a halt, watching in horror as the silhouette detached fully from his feet, rising up from the ground, taking a shape eerily similar to his own. Its form flickered like static, shifting, distorting. Too tall, too thin. Limbs stretching grotesquely before snapping back into place. Then it lunged. Ethan threw himself to the side just in time, hitting the ground hard as the shadowy doppelganger shot past him, its inky form dispersing for a split second before reassembling. The thing turned toward him, its hollow face unreadable, but its body jittered like a broken puppet, its limbs cracking as they realigned. The walls shuddered. Ethan could feel the entire room breathing, its edges shifting like an optical illusion, distorting reality around them. His duplicate's shadows spread, climbing the walls, stretching across the ceiling, multiplying. A dozen smaller shadows peeled away from it, splintering into grotesque, insect-like shapes, skittering toward him, their movements disjointed yet impossibly fast. He scrambled backward, his palms slick with sweat as his mind screamed at him to get out, to get anywhere but here. Then the whispering started. Not from the creature, not from the shadows. From inside his own head. "You're not real." Ethan clutched at his temples as the words drilled into his skull. He gasped as the world around him rippled, the walls melting like ink in water, the ceiling distorting, tilting inward like it was collapsing onto itself. His shadow twin twitched violently, its form glitching, breaking apart before pulling itself back together again. The whispers grew louder. "You're just a reflection." The thing rushed him again, but this time Ethan didn't move. His instincts told him to run, to fight, to do something, but a thought clawed its way to the surface of his mind. This isn't real. The moment the shadow collided with him, the world snapped apart. The walls shattered into black fragments, dissolving into nothingness, and Ethan felt himself falling. Down, down, deeper into the abyss, his breath ripped from his lungs as the darkness swallowed him whole. Chapter 14. The Last Light in the House. Ethan landed hard, his body slamming against a cold, unyielding surface. His breath came in short gasps as the darkness coiled around him, pressing in from all sides. There was nothing here, no walls, no ceiling, no ground he could see, only the sensation of solid, ice-cold stone beneath his palms. Then, far in the distance, a light flickered. A single small glow, a candle wavering in the void. It shouldn't have been possible. There had been no light, no escape, and yet now it beckoned him forward. Ethan pushed himself to his feet, his legs unsteady, his muscles aching. Every instinct screamed at him to stay still, to not trust what lay ahead, but something about the light pulled at him, as if it were the only real thing in this abyss. As he stepped forward, the whispering returned. Faint at first, distant murmurs layered on top of each other, growing louder with each hesitant step. The shadows around him began to shift, moving like living ink, writhing, forming shapes that stretched and loomed over him. Then, a hand shot out from the darkness beside him, grasping at his arm. Ethan recoiled, nearly stumbling. The hand was pale, its fingers elongated and wrong, its grip like ice. He yanked himself free and staggered back, heart hammering. The whispers hissed. The figures in the dark moved closer. The light flickered. He had no choice. He ran. The ground beneath him was unsteady, shifting like loose sand, but he pushed forward, his focus locked on the single, fragile light ahead. The whispering rose into a deafening chorus, voices overlapping, some pleading, some laughing, some calling his name. And then, the candlelight vanished. Ethan skidded to a halt. The abyss swallowed everything, leaving him in absolute darkness. His breath came in ragged bursts as silence crashed over him, suffocating. Then a voice, clear and unmistakable, whispered behind him. "You were never supposed to find the light," and the last of the darkness closed in. Chapter 15. Trapped in the darkness. Ethan's breath came in short gasps, his chest tightening as the abyss closed in around him. There was nothing. No walls, no floor beneath his feet, no air to carry sound. The darkness was thick, suffocating, swallowing every breath, every movement, every thought. He reached out, grasping at nothing, his fingers curled into the void, desperate for an anchor, for anything real. But the darkness had no edges, no escape. Then, a voice. "He's on. You don't belong here." The words slithered through the silence, echoing without an origin, reverberating in his skull. He turned sharply, but there was no direction to face, no light to guide him. The shadows themselves felt alive, shifting around him in waves. Then he heard it again. "You never did." A figure emerged from the blackness, a silhouette with no features, no discernible shape, only his own outline, standing, too still. Ethan's pulse spiked, his throat clenched as he tried to move, to run, but the darkness beneath him held him in place. The figure stepped closer and closer. Ethan opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figure leaned in until it was inches from his face. Then, in a whisper, it spoke. "You are the shadow now." The words sank into Ethan's bones, colder than ice, heavier than the void surrounding him. He wanted to fight back, to deny what was happening, but his limbs had begun to change. His skin tingled, darkening, dissolving, melting into the abyss. He tried to take a step back, but there was no ground beneath him, only the sensation of falling, though he remained perfectly still. The figure before him watched, head tilted in something that might have been curiosity or hunger. The whispering started again. This time it wasn't just one voice. It was thousands. They spoke over each other in a maddening chorus, words intertwining, whispering secrets Ethan couldn't comprehend, yet somehow felt in his very soul. The darkness pulsed around him, contracting, consuming, swallowing everything that was Ethan Carter. Memories unraveled, his childhood, his mother's voice, the feel of the sun on his skin, all slipping away. His body stretched, or maybe it shrank, he couldn't tell anymore. His edges blurred, his outline faded. The last thing he saw before the world dissolved was the figure standing before him. It no longer had Ethan's shape. It had grown taller, leaner, more defined. He smiled. Then, in the abyss, a new light flickered. A distant candle, wavering, waiting. A new voice, lost and afraid, whispered into the void. "Hello? Is someone there?" And Ethan understood. The cycle had begun again.